Hi, welcome back, everybody. I am here again with Professor Larry Catá to discuss his book. We're discussing Chapter 12, Resist and Reconcile, the opinions of the CPC Central Committee and the State Council supporting Shenzhen's pioneering demonstration zone with Chinese characteristics, Monday, August 19, 2019. How are you doing, Professor?
All right. That was quite a mouthful too. And I just wanted to point out, we have behind me the cover for the paperback edition of the book. Matthew has got the ebook book cover behind him. So look out for the book. It is available for ordering in either paperback or EPUB on Kindle and the other large retailers. So buy early and often. Um, you never know if I sneak in a different set of essays from one to no, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, so there it is, and I am looking forward to discuss a chapter that's actually quite different
Well,
from the others. This was one of these aha moments.
hmm. Well, you're a natural Billy Mays out here just selling your product, so I'm proud of you.
Oh Lord, no.
First I'd like to say August 19th, 2019, when you wrote this, I like to put in perspective where I was when you were writing this because I didn't know you at this time.
Right.
And of course, I looked you up because I looked up all the professors here. But August 19th, I had just moved to Penn State. And so that's why I can like register exactly where I was on this date. But getting to this chapter and where you were on this date, let's talk about resist and reconcile. To resist, you must reconcile. To reconcile, you must resist. What does that mean?
Right. Essentially, it's a rhetorical trope. And for those of you who will get the book, there are a number of chapters where I go back and look at the way in which, and I'm going to mispronounce it again, Guiguze, the scholar from Gui, um, and one of the earliest and most profound writers of Chinese rhetoric, how some of those techniques uh, might contribute some insight to what is going on in Hong Kong. And I found Resist-Reconcile, Wuhe, along with the an earlier one that we talked about, um, which was the notion of assessing or quan, to be quite relevant in this context. Um, and again, we're not dealing with opposites. We're dealing with a tension between forces that, in a sense, a dialectic here that, when used appropriately, can lead to a not a synthesis, but lead to the attainment of the objective that you're looking at. And here the question is one of essentially breaking apart and bringing things back together. And that appeared to be particularly useful in this context, because we're looking at reconciling and resisting now in the physical space, not that of the protesters, but in the physical space in which Hong Kong itself found itself. Right. And here, of course, I'm referring to the situation and the dramatically evolving situation of Hong Kong in the Pearl River area.
Okay. And so in the Pearl River area, I think you talk about the positioning of Hong Kong and the rise of Shenzhen. Can you go further into that?
Well, sure. Um, when when we look at Hong Kong, and when people think about Hong Kong, they view it in a sense as is sort of like a medieval fortress up on a hill surrounded by a moat with lots of land between it and the next fortress. So it's important because where it sits, and here strategically it was incredibly important, and because in a sense it tends to control a strategic area and control a strategic function within that area. And certainly in the 80s and 90s, Hong Kong served that purpose. It was the most prosperous, the most well-integrated city within China, and well integrated within the currents of global trade as it was emerging in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. And for that reason was viewed as the centerpiece, the driving engine of everything that was going on in South China. But recall where Hong Kong is. Hong Kong is a stone's throw, by the way, these things are measured, from Guangzhou. And even as the Chinese central authorities were moving towards the reincorporation of Hong Kong into China, they were also moving towards the reincorporation of that region into something very different. It's not for nothing that at roughly the time that all of this is going on, that Deng Xiaoping travels down and literally at the border between Hong Kong and the mainland, he says, oh, look, here's a little fishing village, less of a fishing village even by then, but here's this little village, Shenzhen, just a few miles down the road from Guangzhou. What a wonderful place in which we can now build the factories, build our vision, in the reform and opening up vision of the modernizing China, the development of productive forces, the modernization of the state, and the movement towards the new prosperity for the country by building the factories literally across the border from the place where financing deals, trade is actually occurring. And so all of a sudden you go from Hong Kong being this a little bit of manufacturing, but relatively speaking, to trade and movement of goods, right, to a place that increasingly becomes just the outward face of a much more complicated physical space that is meant to integrate and embody the entirety of the new industrial and trading and finance space of China. And so all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it took a generation or so. One finds it increasingly difficult to talk about Hong Kong in isolation, and certainly from the perspective of the central government, and that's the point of this. What I was extracting at this point, because from the opinion piece. The Chinese central authorities are more than well aware of this. And so it was curious to me that in the middle of this first phase of the protests, that one of the things that should appear, right, in the process of all of this was, yeah, Hong Kong, Hong Kong, Hong Kong. Oh, look, here we go. Let's talk about Shenzhen's pioneering demonstration zone with Chinese characteristics. A reminder to all of the stakeholders, both the local authorities who are not, at least as far as the central authorities were concerned, who are not quite doing their job, the protesters and the foreigners, that indeed Hong Kong was no longer detachable, and that one had to begin to understand Hong Kong in a somewhat different geophysical space.
So in a sense, it was almost like, you're not that special anymore. It's kind of, that was the messaging.
Well, in part it's that you're not that special, but much more, you're not that unique. Okay. Necessary to us. You're still important, you're still vital, you're still useful, and no, you're not going anywhere. And yes, we want to continue to support you in accordance with the way in which we view your place within this vast space that is China, with some sensitivity to your origins and to the way in which you tend to operate as, the quirks, but that understand that this is not a separate city state that has a eternal set of core liberties that can exist in isolation from everything around it, but that indeed when you start talking about all of those things, when you start talking about two systems, you have to talk about two systems as a function of where it sits within, in this case, within the Pearl River Delta, Shenzhen right next door, Guangzhou, and a number of other cities, and then ultimately Macau as well. And so that integration then becomes interesting. And of course, the underlining here is the notion that, well, it's not just that you're being integrated, but that integration itself will drive to some extent the way in which the central authorities will weigh and value factors that ultimately will produce the application of the limitations and constraints of the two systems part of one country, two systems. And so from a rhetorical perspective, which is where I was looking at this, right, we have a reconciliation of the resistance that is Hong Kong by not focusing on Hong Kong, but on reconciling Hong Kong within a greater space. So that Hong Kong now becomes something other than Hong Kong. It's Hong Kong within Pearl River, within Greater China, as opposed to the resistance Hong Kong as a city-state, which is itself, which can be pulled apart from and exists next to, but not necessarily integrated with the rest. And so from my perspective, this was a very interesting intervention given its timing, right, in the course of the protest. It was in a lot of ways rhetorical, right, in the sense that it served as signaling, and therefore could be seen as a warning not just to the protesters, but a warning as well to the foreigners and foreign interests. And foreign interests includes the international community, includes the British and the joint declaration, who might have seen in this what they viewed as a narrative of the autonomous city-state, right, within the Holy Roman Empire, right, this autonomous city-state with its own liberties, as something that the Chinese would reject, precisely because there is no autonomous city-state. There is no thing that exists in a glorious isolation. There is something that increasingly, and from the beginning of this process, was meant to be not absorbed, but was meant to ultimately become part of something larger. Within
So I would, oh, are you done?
Yeah, yes, sir.
My fault. I didn't mean to cut you off. But I would like to finish with more of a two-part question.
Yeah.
First part would be, was this foreseen, and was the positioning of a city like Shenzhen planned just in case a situation like this occurred? And so I'd like you to answer that question first.
Okay, yeah. Opinions differ.
Okay.
One thing I think everyone agrees, it was a brilliant stroke. Was it meant as defensive or offensive? Was it meant aggressively or benignly? Was it meant as an integrative tool or as a tool to prevent, to resist? It's not clear. But even expressing it this way brings us back to that rhetorical trope of resist and reconcile, right? Resistance brings reconciliation, reconciliation understood as a function of resistance. And so the answer, I think, may well be a combination of all of that. It becomes critically important, for example, that if Hong Kong is going to be the gateway out, in a go out policy for China to embed itself, to advance its industrial engagement emerging global production chains, it becomes important for factories to reduce costs. And one of the major costs, for example, in a very large place like China's transportation costs, if these things are being shipped out of a huge natural port, why not put this right next to the natural port? Why not have the factories close to where the deals are made? Why do you need that? Because people are going to want to do quality control checks. People are going to want to look at factories. Where better to affect technology transfers than in places where it's easier for foreigners to get in and out of? Where better to build a model socialist beacon of the China that is emerging than in a space that is open and ready for it. So you're not rehabbing, you're building this new model ideal socialist embodiment of development, right? And at the same time, right, when you do this, you're also putting a tremendous pressure on Hong Kong in the sense that to the extent that Shenzhen becomes more and more indispensable, more and more a key element to this process, right? You develop these markers of dependency so that resistance becomes more difficult, right? Was it a space, was it a space from where you could invade Hong Kong if they got too rambunctious? I suppose that you can find someone among the 1.5 billion people in China who might have taken the position. I suspect that by the late 90s, certainly no one thought that way. And even by the early 80s, it was just, it would have been difficult to have gotten a lot of takers for that. 60s and 70s, everything was possible, but it was a different way of looking at things. But certainly in terms of applying a spatial dimension to integration, right, on a variety of different levels, the idea of Shenzhen was just marvelous. And in this context, of course, becomes critical both to the narrative, which is the point here, critical to the narrative, and also a critical reminder of the realities that that people had to face on the ground.
The second part of this question is a little bit unrelated, but during the book launch, we talked about China's concerns or the central government's concerns. And it was raised by one of the panelists that there may have been a belief that the sentiments from Hong Kong would be like a rot or a virus that could spread to other parts. Was there concern that it could spread to a town like Shenzhen, and does that force the speech about Shenzhen or bringing them up in the speech that they made?
Well, again, in a country of 1.5 billion people, you're likely to find someone who would take that view. Yes,
Okay.
and indeed, I raised the issue of the problem of the protests being a virus, and there had been some concern that two systems might itself there might be a temptation for other people on the mainland to view two systems as a template for reform within China. That never really worked out all that well. And the central authorities were very, very good at border control.
Okay.
Were very, very good at border control. So while there may have been some leaking from time to time and in different ways, and the nature of the toleration of that was vastly different before 2013 than after 2013. It was never anything that would have caused significant worry until, right, the dress rehearsal was the umbrella movement in 2014, and then boom, the big test in 2019.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we have for this chapter. I will also implore everybody that is watching this to go out and buy the book. Would you like to finish us off with anything, Professor Backer?
No, but again, thank you thank you very much. Again, another interesting discussion, but for our potential readers, just a tiny little taste, hopefully, of what you might be able to glean from the chapter itself. But thank you very much for listening in. If I leave you with any insight, it is that connectivity between Hong Kong and its place within China, the Pearl River Basin. And the second insight, that connection was very, very much on the minds, I think, of the central authorities as the protests began to begin to develop a kind of permanence. It wasn't going away by the middle of August, and that at that point, Shenzhen comes to, at least in a narrative context, comes back on the table. And with that, it opens up our way to begin to look towards the next phase of the protests and the responses from all the major actors, which we will turn to when we start looking at chapter 13 for our next conversation.
Well, that sounds good, and I can't wait for it.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much.
All right.
It's always a pleasure.
Nice talking to you as well.
All right.